Today's project is the Iron Helmet from Skyrim. Today we're going to be turning a basic 3D print into something that looks like this, a completed prop. But before we get it to look like this, there's a couple steps that we have to do first. So I've primed all the pieces. Took all the parts, gave them a once over with this gray primer, gave the underside a misting of black spray paint, basically hide the inside of the helmet. Next step is to start the glue up of the main dome piece, do some sanding. The glue has dried, I'll hit it with another layer of primer and do some more sanding and priming and sanding and priming. That's how it goes. Now it's time for the glue up. I'm going to be using Gorilla Glue, A, because of its strength, B, try to fill in this gap a little bit. If necessary, I'll use some other gap filler, but I'm going to try to use Gorilla for the moment and see how that works. Now before I start the glue up, I'm going to be putting pegs into the halves of the helmet. This helps with alignment and to just keep the two halves together while it's in the glue up phase. I printed this to fit my head, printed this at 110% because printer tolerances are sometimes kind of iffy. I printed the pegs at 105%. That way I was sure that they would fit in properly. And they're still very snug. Now I'm just going to take a thin stripe all the way around, particularly at the corners. Press the two halves together and some squeeze out is okay. I'm going to be sanding this over anyway. There we go. Now while I wait for this to set, I can start the sanding and priming of the next couple elements, like the back pieces and the mask piece and the horns. But I don't need it to be incredibly smooth because I'm mainly getting rid of the layer lines. The whole piece has a handmade rough feel to it, so any roughness I could just work into the aesthetic of the piece. Now while I wait for the face section and the back of the head to dry, I can start working on sanding the dome. Alright, so the next step is the glue up for the majority of the helmet. From here, I'm going to be using more of these little pegs. Now I'm going to join the two halves of the lower helmet section. A little bit of fast drying super glue, running it along the seam on each side. I don't think this needs something stronger like Gorilla Glue because it's going to be reinforced with the rest of the dome. I think it'll be just fine with a little bit of super glue because again the dome will be acting as a structural support And the next step is to start sanding on the horns. So like usual, I'm going to start with a high grit and work into a lower grit. This is a 60 grit, and I'm going to eventually do a 220 grit. Some people don't like sanding. I personally like sanding. It's kind of got this therapeutic monotony to it. It's hard to mess up sanding. You can kind of just zone out, stop worrying about stuff, and just sand. You don't need to really think about sanding too much. Just as long as you have even coverage across the whole piece and you're happy with it in the end. Time for the fun part, which is the weathering and putting in all the battle damage. First step is to figure out really which areas are the big areas that we want to get damaged. The face area of the helmet would be the one that would incur the most damage naturally, so that's where I'm going to put in the most cuts and slashes and dirty spots. So I'm going to start by buffing down some of the shiny points. This thing overall, I want a metallic finish, but it's just too shiny at the moment. It's not what I want. It looks almost like a bad chrome look versus that rough hewn iron look that I'm going for. So some of the green is starting to show through the silver paint that I put down, but I'm not worried because I'm going to be putting down more paint. The first coat I'll be starting with is this. It's called a tin color. It's just a very dark metallic color. That's my starting point. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to take some of this tin color. A lot of the color work that's going to be going down on this is going to be very splotchy and uneven and rustic. So I'm not aiming for something that is very refined. It's one of the most basic helmets in Skyrim. I'm going to be using a basic chip brush and a sponge brush. The chip brush is just going to be used to apply the majority of the color. It's not as dark as I'd prefer, but it seems to be doing okay for at least a first color. I might try mixing it with some darker paints that I have. I'm not quite happy with this exact shade of metal, so I'm going to try darkening it just a little bit. See how that looks. This is definitely a better color so far. So I'm going to let this dry for a bit, and then I'm going to start working on these face details in the mask section of these little runic details. Now, for these little face details, I'm going to be using enamel paints. And just as a precaution, make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area because enamel paints can get smelly. Let's see if this stuff's... Oh, it looks like it's still good. Okay. This enamel paint is pretty close to the color that I was using for the base. So that means maybe plan B. I have a second color of acrylic, which might work instead. This color is significantly lighter. Both kind of... I wonder if I should put down a layer of... I should put down... Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a layer of white where I want the highlights to be, and that will help brighten them. And now I'm going to try to paint over the top of the lighter areas with this light metal color as to try to highlight the rune design. And I think that's working. That looks pretty good. It could be better, so I'm going to try to use the enamel and see if that creates any stronger of a silver color. So I think I do like the enamel color a little bit stronger. It's a little bit stronger of a metal finish. It just pops that little extra bit. Granted, this whole area is not really supposed to pop, it's more of a faded rune design. So, now that all the runic sections have dried, the next step is to add rust. Looking at the photos in the game, the rust looks like it's a combination of some brown, some dark red, and some yellowy orange. Been almost out of burnt umber for like the last 3 videos, but gonna have to make it work. Red, orangish yellow. And I'm just going to loosely mix the colors. Looking at the reference, it looks like it's mostly above the eyes and on the nose section and right below the eyes. Here we go. And then wipe it off. It's almost like weathering. It is very similar to weathering, but not with the weathering colors. It's with the rust set of colors. This makes sense because down by the ears would be the parts that would get dirtier because they would be harder to clean with the horns in the way. And it is concentrated at the front, so I need to kind of disperse it through the rest. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Now from there, what I want to do is redder rust color and just highlight a few spots. Again, I don't want to make it look like blood. I don't like having big gory pieces. So now that the rust has been rusted, it's time to add the general weathering. It's done in a similar color profile, but just mix in some more black. When weathering, you want to have your paper towel on hand and just start going to town on it. Still too reddish brown. What you want to do is you want to put it on there and then attack it as aggressively as possible with the paper towel, and it'll end up staining and leaving behind a lot of the pigment, which is really what you want when you're weathering, not to actually put on another coat of paint, but just to stain it. Okay, so that is the weathering done for the most part. I might come back later and touch up some spots. But now onto the horns. So the color of animal bone is this yellowy white color that I think what it's going to be is a majority of white and then just the littlest bit of yellow to kind of give it that right color. I'm going to start with a base coat of just white. This is I'm putting on a pretty thin coat so that it will dry quickly. Okay, so that's the base coat. Next step is to add just the tiniest amount of yellow, and that's a pretty good start color. I think this is probably going to need 2 coats. The final step of painting up the horns is doing the little detailing on the ridges just to make the ridges stand out more, be a little bit more pronounced. So what I'm going to be using is dark red and just the tiniest dot of black. There we go. From here we just fill in the ridges. Still a little too red. So what I've done is I sanded down the ear sections where the horns will go, and I've sanded down where the horns meet with the earpiece. They have these registration pegs, and those will help. But on top of that, I'm going to hot glue them in place. Rather than using something like a stronger glue, like a super glue or a Gorilla Glue, hot glue is purposely weaker. I wouldn't want a strong glue to hold these in, because then if these were to fall or to get hit, then the horn would break as opposed to the joint breaking. And then the joint would be much easier to fix than fixing or printing a brand new horn. It is a intentional design weakness. That is the finished helmet. This was about a week of print time, and the assembly and glue up was spread across 4 nights. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. Really pleased with how the rust works with the weathering. It's not too overpowering, shows up really nice on screen, and of course, try it on.